This is question number 6. In clinical trials of a medication used to treat arthritis, 12% of users reported dizziness as a side effect out of the 300 trial participants. So what I see here, I see a sample size 300, and then I see a proportion that is reported out of the participants, which is out of the sample size, which makes this proportion a sample proportion. So I do have a sample proportion p hat is 12% or 0.12, and I have the sample size 300. We need to compute the margin of error at 90% confidence level. So that is the second question. The first question is asking about the z-score, which is basically the critical value. So before we get to the critical value, let's see if we can compute the margin of error first, because the critical value is going to depend on the margin of error. The margin of error is basically 90%, which makes the area in both tails 10%, which makes the area in each tail 5%. So the critical values are going to be symmetrical. One is positive and the other one is negative, and they're going to be the cutoff for 5% because the area in both tails is 10%, so the area in one tail is 5%. So I will be using a calculator here in online calculator, and I will be basically using one of the options. So I'm going to go to the home page first. Let me minimize this. So the calculator I will be using here is estimating a population proportion, because confidence interval for proportion means estimating a population proportion. That is this link right here. Was given p hat, which is 0.12. And then n is 300, and the confidence level is 90%, and that will give me the margin of error. Notice this notation of confidence interval involves the point estimate, which is p hat plus or minus the margin of error. So this number right here that I highlighted is the margin of error. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take it and plug it right here. Notice also in this calculator, there is a z-score, which is basically the critical value. The cutoff for the middle 90% is positive and negative 1.6449. The only one that is visible is the positive one, so that's what I'm going to take and plug in the first one. And then to answer the remaining questions, it's basically a matter of going back to the calculator and seeing what we have there. The second question here, or part C, says construct a 90% confidence interval for the proportions of users that experience dizziness or on this medication. This notation indicates that I have to include the point estimate at the beginning and then the margin of error, which is this one, in the second box, plus or minus the margin of error. That is how we compute basically the lower bound and the upper bound. In order to figure out the upper bound and the lower bound, for the lower bound we're going to subtract 0.12 minus the margin of error, and luckily the calculator does that for us, so we do have the lower bound computed here. We don't have to do any extra math, so I'm just going to do and copy and paste, and the upper bound as well. So the upper bound is basically the point estimate plus the margin of error. You could use the previous branch to compute the lower bound and the upper bound, but the calculator does that for us, so we don't need to. So that is so far the answers to parts A through D. The next part is interpret the confidence interval from part D. We're going to say we are 90% confident that the proportions of users, or the population proportions of users reported dizziness. I'm going to copy this part. Okay, I'm going to say the population proportion of, and then I'm going to paste what I copied from there. So the population proportions of users reported dizziness as a side effect out of the 300 trial participants is between side effect, let me remove the sample size, as a side effect for using this medication is between the lower bound at the upper bound, and I can report it as percentages. So I can say using I can say 8.91% and 15.09%. I can turn it into a percentage basically. This last part, based on the results of the confidence interval, you can conclude more than 16.08 of the users. Can you conclude that more than 16.08 of the users would experience dizziness? The answer is no. Why is that? Because notice how 16.08 is more than the upper bound, so it's outside of the confidence interval that we have here. Because we can say 16.08% is not inside the confidence interval. And I need to fix that. So that is how you're going to interpret these parts. And if you submit your answer, if you get 75%, that means you did everything correctly. These boxes are not going to be graded automatically, but you should know how to interpret and how to answer any other question related to confidence intervals if that is the case. But these are not going to be automatically graded, so you will wait for me until I grade them for you. But this video serves as your self-check for the correct answer. So hopefully that is helpful. And if you have any questions, let me know.